During the Berlin Conference, France was divided with the area of what is now Chad. This was a very difficult region to get to, and only after pacifying the areas surrounding it were the French able to send expeditions to put it under control. These would take place between 1898 and 1900, where 3 columns, one from Senegal, one from the French Congo, and one from Algeria, would meet up at Lake Chad and establish a fort. These are their stories. The voulet-chanoine mission left Senegal in November of 1898, beginning its long journey east. It contained a few French officers, 50 Senegalese tirailleurs, 20 spahis, about 24 translators, 400 auxiliary troops, and 800 porters. It was led by Paul Voulet and Julien Chanoine, both of whom were absolutely mentally insane, but we'll see more of that later. In December, Voulet had managed to make it to Timbuktu with a handful of his men, meeting the friendly governor, Jean-François Clope. Clope gifted Voulet another 70 tirailleurs and 20 spahis. By January of 1899, the 1,400-strong expedition had made it to Saï, the easternmost outpost under French control. Everything past this was essentially autonomous and undiscovered. But right around the time of arriving in Saï, the expedition had basically run out of supplies, so Voulet and Chanoine ordered their men to plunder all villages they came across. Any civilians who resisted would be shot. Voulet and Chanoine went crazy. They then ordered their men to execute and slaughter the inhabitants of all villages they came across, killing hundreds of civilians every day. Rapes were widespread, and murder was a daily task for the troops. Any soldiers who disagreed would be killed. Anybody who greatly displeased Voulet would be tied up alive and left for the vultures. The 7 other French officers who were traveling with Voulet and Chanoine were absolutely disgusted, and less than a month later, Lieutenant Petot decided to leave, so Voulet dismissed him. Petot wrote a letter to his fiancée in Paris, telling her of all the atrocities taking place. His fiancée was disgusted as well, and sent a letter to a local politician, who then wrote to the Minister of Colonies. This all led to the French government ordering the immediate cessation of the expedition and the arrest of both Voulet and Chanoine. Clope was sent with another French officer and 50 tirailleurs to arrest Voulet and Chanoine and take control of the expedition, and Clope left Timbuktu in mid-April. Meanwhile, the expedition was moving through the brush, murdering and looting. Eventually, the native people began to take action, and small skirmishes would often happen with native archers periodically shooting out into the column. On the 19th of April, Queen Saronia of the Azna people assembled a sizable force to combat the French, a few hundred strong at least. The Azna people made their stand in the town of Lugo, in modern-day Niger. The Battle of Lugo was quick, with 4 tirailleurs killed, as well as somewhere around 24 Azna people. The French eventually fell back when the fighting got too tough. On May the 8th, the expedition performed one of the worst massacres of the whole scramble for Africa. In one day, the troops slaughtered the entire village of Birni and Koni, killing several thousand people. The violence only got more intense from there. Hangings of innocent people, spit-roasting children, among other things. On the 10th of July, Clope finally caught up with the expedition. Clope sent a letter to Voulet while he was still a short distance away, telling him that he was there to arrest him. Voulet wrote back to Clope, telling him not to try. Clope thought that the other 6 French officers would never let harm come to a fellow French officer. But when Clope showed up, it was only Voulet and a bunch of tirailleurs. Voulet told Clope not to come any closer, and when he did, his men opened fire. Clope was killed instantly, and his guards fell back. That night, Voulet went absolutely crazy. His officers found out about what happened, and both them and the troops were planning on mutinying. Voulet and Chanoine heard about this and assembled all the troops to start paging them. They then started shooting them, so the troops shot back, killing Chanoine and making Voulet flee. Voulet fled but returned the following morning. He tried threatening the guard at the entrance of the camp, but was shot dead. The rest of the French officers took over the expedition and captured Zinder on July 30th. Shortly afterwards, the troops got fed up and wanted to go home, so over half the column left to head back west after thoroughly pacifying the area. Then, 170 troops under Lieutenant Paul Joaland left on October 3rd to continue the expedition, and 100 troops under Sergeant Bouthel were left in Zinder to garrison it. By the time the expedition met with the Lamy mission in January of 1900, it was a quarter of what it once was. Émile Gentil was sent north from the French Congo to reach Lake Chad. His route was the shortest, but the most harrowing. Throughout today what is southern Chad, a warlord by the name of Rabih az-Zubayr was wreaking havoc and carving out an empire. At the time, the French didn't see how much of a danger he was, and thought of his men as yet another poor African warband. In reality, several thousand of his men were trained and armed with the latest in military equipment, bought or stolen from Europeans and colonial infantry. In October of 1898, Rabih attacked the kingdom of Baguirmi, a small Chadian kingdom which was an ally of the French. Lieutenant Henry Bretonnet, 4 European officers, and 45 tirailleurs had been sent to the French Congo in advance of Gentil's much larger force, to set up for and plan the expedition. When the French government heard about the attack in Baguirmi, Bretonnet was hastily sent with his 50 men to meet up with some Baguirmian troops and hold off Rabih's forces. Bretonnet arrived at the town of Kourounou on June 15, 1899. This is on the Chari River, just north of Fort Archibald, which is today Sar. At this point, the Gentil mission had just begun moving. Bretonnet met with King Guarang of the Baguirmi, who then supplied him with an additional 400 lightly armed Baguirmian men. Meanwhile, Rabih was on the march towards Kourounou with 2,700 of his rifle-armed men and 10,000 auxiliaries. Bretonnet sent a letter to Gentil on the 8th of July, requesting he send 130 men quickly towards his position, as he thought Rabih's forces may be stronger than his. He was right. On the 16th of July, Rabih arrived. Bretonnet was absolutely shocked at the size of his army and moved his men to the nearby Togbao hills. Rabih's men attacked early on the 17th and annihilated Bretonnet's forces. Half of the Baguirmians were killed, and all but 3 tirailleurs out of Bretonnet's column. Of those 3, only one was able to escape and brought the news of the defeat southwards to Gentil on the 16th of August. Gentil would arrive at the French outpost of Fort Archambault in late September. On October 23rd, he set out with his expedition towards Kourounou, where Rabih's forces were still encamped. He had about 330 tirailleurs, a dozen or so French officers, and 5 cannons, 2 of which were on 2 boats he had on the Chari River. Rabih's force consisted of nearly 13,000, but the French troops were far better armed and trained. The French force advanced until they were nearing the Togbao battlefield on the 26th. Then the boats and infantry column made a joint attack on the 28th of October. Only a few thousand of Rabih's men were actually engaged, and the French were doing well, but they were still outnumbered heavily. Gentil was also battering Rabih's fort. A few hours later, many of Rabih's men began to flee, but Rabih jumped in and his men came back, eventually fending off Gentil's forces. The French suffered 46 killed and 106 wounded, and Rabih's men possibly suffered 1,000 killed or wounded. Gentil then decided to retreat to Fort Archambault and await the other expeditions. The Fourreau-Lamy mission was commanded by Major François-Amédée Lamy and Fernand Fourreau. It was the longest and arguably least eventful expedition. The expedition consisted of 46 Frenchmen, 260 tirailleurs, 13 Spahis, and 70 Arabs. Rather than porters, the expedition employed 1,200 camels. The expedition assembled and began at Ouargla on October 23, 1898. They spent the next 4 months traveling through some of the harshest desert on Earth. On February 24, 1899, they arrived at Ifourein and encamped there for 3 months. They then traveled south and stayed in Agadez for 3 more months. During this time, the expedition was attacked by Tuareg bandits a few times. Several Frenchmen and over a dozen tirailleurs were killed in these raids. They left Agadez in October and reached Zinder in late December, where they combined with the first half of what was left of the voulet-chanoine mission under Bouthel and switched out their camels for horses and donkeys. In early January of 1900, the expedition left Zinder towards Lake Chad. They encountered tough local resistance by the angry natives, but eventually made it to Lake Chad in late January. They had a tough time traversing the swamp and mud, and didn't get to the east shore until February. Here they met up with the second half of what was left of the voulet-chanoine mission under Lieutenant Joland. The expeditions combined and went south along the Chari River. Then, they heard that Rabih was heading to the town of Kosari and headed there. Gentil also headed there, and the two forces met up and combined into one giant one under Lamy in mid-March. The expeditions waited for a month in Kosari, which was actually in German Cameroon, until a group of 800 Bagirmian warriors showed up to join them. The French then had 1,500 troops, 800 Bagirmians and 700 Frenchmen, mostly tirailleurs. On April 22nd, Lamy gathered his troops and marched on Rabih's camp near Kosari for one big, decisive battle. Looking at the figures, Rabih outnumbered the French by nearly 7 times, but outside of Rabih's 2,000-strong, well-armed warband, his troops were garbage. Even his elite warband was nothing compared to the French, who also had modern cannons and machine guns. Lamy, who was always full of himself, stupidly rode among his foot soldiers on horseback, with his medals and rank showing. Rabih's sharpshooters easily picked him out and he was shot dead during the first charge. He and 27 other French and Bagirmian troops were killed, but the French obliterated Rabih's army, killing over 1,200 of Rabih's men and injuring and/or capturing several thousand more. Rabih himself was shot through the back of the head while he tried to escape over the Chari River. With Rabih's death and his warband killed, his empire disintegrated in an instant. France would then fully annex the region and create the colony of French Chad. Émile Gentil, the only original expedition leader who was still alive, was made its first governor, and the capital, what is now N'Djamena, was called Fort Lamy. France would hold Chad for another 60 years thanks to these expeditions.